and welcome to the final step in making your Dolly Mixtures quilt. This has been a long project for me. It's taken me about 3 years to design and write, and then it's been our year of making, so really fun, and I hope you've enjoyed sewing along with me. Can't wait to see your finished quilts in our Facebook group, or you can post them on my Facebook page or send them to me by email and I can put them up for you. What we're going to do now is we're going to start joining all the blocks together, and there are pieces of sashings that go in between, so I've given you the cutting list for both the sashings and for these final borders. The only thing you may not have done before is a partial seam, and I've made you a video on how to do that. Very easy and step by step. So enjoy putting this together, and can't wait to see your pictures. Let's get started. Before you start joining your pieces together, here are a few tips. First of all, your sashing lengths are really important. If you cut them to the size and then pin your blocks on to fit the measurements of the sashings, that's going to mean that everything fits together correctly. If you find that one of your blocks is way out, you can always add some extra fabric to make it a bit bigger, or you can possibly trim. The second tip is divide and conquer. So what I mean by that is if you're joining a long piece of sashing or border onto your quilt, once you've cut it to size, pin it at the ends, pin the middles, match those up, then divide that into half so you've got quarters, and then you can divide that. The more you do that and pin it, the more everything's going to fit. You don't want to see bits of sashing sticking out at the end, because what would be the point of measuring them if you did that? The third tip is trying not to twist your seams. Easier said than done sometimes, but you can always unpick a seam and flip it over if you're finding that you're getting twists in them. That just keeps everything flatter and easier for quilting. Sew with the most seams upwards. So if you're joining a strip of sashing onto a series of blocks, if you sew in your sewing machine, have the blocks on the top and the strip on the bottom, it means that you can keep an eye on the direction of your seams as you go. Keep your edges of your fabric aligned all the way along, so that means that your 1/4 inch seam is going to work. When you're doing a long seam, it's quite easy for your edges of fabric as you're sewing to start drifting, so just keep an eye on them and don't go too fast. And then once you get to the end, if you want to, you can measure the quilt to get your border lengths rather than just go by my measurements. I actually found that my top and bottom inner borders, the white ones, I had to cut to 71 instead of 71.5. So what you'll find is that at the point where you're adding the borders, it doesn't matter if they're not exactly the measurements that I've given you, it's what fits. So take your tape measure, measure down the center of the quilt, and then cut your borders to that size. And I use a tape measure to do that. So once you've then measured down vertically and put on your side borders, then measure horizontally and put your top and bottom borders on. Now it's really important that you cut those borders the same size, so the left and right match and the top and bottom match. That's going to keep everything nice and straight, and your long arm quilter, if you use one, will love you for it, and you'll love yourself for it when you're pinning everything. That's the way to avoid wavy borders. So let's get started with joining our blocks. The first thing you're going to do is to take your bird's block, the block with the 3 flowers and checkerboard A, and just join those up together. Now you can add the ring a rosy block to the right and checkerboard B to the bottom. Now set that section aside for a moment. You're going to take your swings block with the 5 swings on and join it to the top of the small houses block. And I've got the pink on the right of the swings. And then take your 1.5 by 14.5 inch strip of sashing, join that onto the right, and then put your 1 1/4 by 13.5-inch strip on the bottom. Then you're going to join the on-point block to the left of the swings and houses, and then you can put those onto the bottom of the first section. Now you're going to take your longer swings block, and it's got the larger oval on the left hand side. Join it onto the diamonds block and then add checkerboard C onto the top. And now you can join the trees block onto the right of that. Now you're going to sew your hearts, the vertical hearts block, to the checkers, and then we're going to sew our partial seam. So in the diagram you can see numbers 1 and 2. You're going to start sewing from 1 as you normally would, but stop at 2, which is about an inch away from the end of the hearts block. And we're now going to build this L-shaped section big enough to add on to the first section of the quilt. So you're going to join the half square triangles block to the right and then add the Wendy house to the bottom. Then you're going to sew checkerboard F and 1 1/2 inch by 34.5 inch sashing strip onto the right. To complete this section, put the triangles and small trees blocks on the bottom. Now you're ready to join these two sections together. I'm going to show you in a real life video. To join this L-shaped section to the Dolly Mixtures, we're doing this with a partial seam. So what I mean by that is that when you join the houses to the hearts and the checkerboards, you stop about an inch away from the end. So now that we've stopped here, we can now add the dollies to the hearts and all these other sections. So this is a regular straightforward seam, and by stopping that inch before, we've got access to this corner. So you're going to pin this and sew this seam down here first. So now we've sewn this seam here, we can complete our partial seam. You've got sewing up to this point. I'm going to sew it from this side, and when I put it in the machine, I'm going to carefully turn the needle down so that it goes into one of the holes made by the previous stitches. And I'll start by sewing over a few of these stitches and then join all the way up to the end of the seam. And now we've got that partial seam out of the way, we're on a roll. Take your triangles, houses and butter churn blocks, join those together. That's the butter churn block with the two rectangles either side, and then put a 1 1/2 by 53.5 strip of sashing on the bottom, and you're going to join those onto the top of the quilt. Then to do the side, you're going to join the other flower block, your schoolhouse, the other butter churn and the squares block together, and put those onto the right hand side. For the next section, you're going to join a 1 1/2 by 30.5 sashing strip to the top and bottom of checkerboard C, and then put the arrows and hopscotch blocks together and put them on the top of that checkerboard. Join your cat's cradle and squares blocks together and add them to the right, and then put your 2 1/2 by 11.5 strip of sashing on the bottom of your compass block and add that to the right. Then you're going to finish off this section by putting a 1 1/2 by 59.5 sashing strip on top, and then join the whole section to the top of the quilt. And now it's time to put the circles and hexagons together. You want the longest circle strips and join them to the hexagon strips. You can see that the bluey purple hexagon joins onto the blue circle at the end of the circle strip that has the pinks, and that's the way around I've done mine. And your shorter circle strips are going to join onto heart blocks, but you just need to add these two little strips onto the heart blocks first. So a 1 inch by 20.5 inch strip goes on the bottom, and a 1 1/2 by 4.5 rectangle goes on the right. Then you join those onto your circle strips. And the top one, you can see the pink is next to the heart, so the pink is always on the right. On the bottom one, the blue is next to the hearts. And now we're ready to add these borders onto the quilt. So before you do that, you need to add 1.5 by 68.25 strips of sashing to the left and right of the quilt, and then put your top and bottom borders on, and then the side borders. Now we're on to the final steps, adding our final borders. So you're going to put the 1.5 by 76.25 inch sashing strips on the sides, and then the 1.5 by 71.5 sashing to the top and bottom, and then finally your black, the 4.5 by 78.25 border strips onto the sides, and then 4.5 by 79.5, the longer ones, go on the top and bottom, and you'll be done.